Yeah.
Okay.
Hi, welcome to Fertility Talks. I'm Mary Wong, founder of Alive Holistic Health Clinic in downtown Toronto, author of the best-selling book, Pathways to Pregnancy, and your acupuncturist and fertility strategist. And tonight, we are super thrilled to have Dr. Dan Nayot with us, REI from Toronto. And we're going to talk about non-invasive endometrial receptivity. And specifically, we're going to talk about endometrial compaction. So for those of you who are watching, and you might go, what the hell is she talking about? Because these are all very big words, but we're going to be able to explain this to you. And before we go take a deep dive into this, I want to formally introduce Dr. Dan Nayot. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here tonight.
No problem. Thanks for having me. I like that description, strategist. I'm going to steal that. It's really good.
I
like it.
I can't stand coach. Like I don't like that.
No, strategist makes sense. I like it. You're guiding them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So here you are a strategist yourself.
I'm a fertility strategist. That's why.
Anyway, you are a fertility specialist practicing in Toronto and associated currently with Trio Fertility, but really soon, and I don't know when exactly, but you're going to be with Fertility Partners and you're going to be the medical director. So excited. Congratulations.
Thank you. I'm very excited. I appreciate that.
Yeah, I want to hear more about it, but that's going to be off camera. Okay. So we're gonna. I love it that you complement your training with like mathematics from U of T and clinical epidemiology from Harvard, and so where you innovate reproductive medicine through research and entrepreneurship. You are also the co-founder of Future Fertility, which is a med tech startup that applies AI, artificial intelligence, to the IVF lab. Like that is so super cool to me. I'm a bit of a science geek myself, so this is all exciting.
You can dive deep tonight. That's great.
And you're the co-founder of Halo Health. That one I actually don't know what that is. Canada's first physician angel network. What does that mean?
So essentially, maybe 3 years ago, I started learning about the, medical startup space, specifically the fertility startup space, because it's the only thing I know a lot about. And the first thing I noticed is that there was like really incredible startups, really smart founders, but most of them were not medical. And so you'd have this amazing solution to a clinical problem that didn't exist.
Right.
And then you would see all these expertise, fertility specialists, OBGYNs, general surgeons, who never really get to see startups. So I was in this really unique position. I kept seeing really neat startups and I kept pointing to the right direction. You really got to talk to Mary. She'll teach you how to really do acupuncture. You really got to talk to this orthopedic surgeon. And I thought if I can connect the right experts with the right startups, it has a much higher chance of succeeding.
Absolutely.
So it's basically a group of entrepreneurial physicians in Canada. We're already 200 doctors strong. We not only just invest in startups, which is like angel investing, but we guide them, we bring them into our clinics, we connect them with our friends who are physicians. We think it's a much higher chance for them to succeed.
Absolutely. Okay, well, we definitely need to keep in touch and talk about these kinds of things for sure.
Yeah.
But let's actually talk about implantation. Yeah. And, there's always such concerns for women. First, of course, it's like the egg quality piece, but then there's a whole other thing. And there's a lot more focus on it in these past couple of years for sure, if not more than that, with regards to implantation. So can you tell us exactly what endometrial receptivity is? What's the definition? Tell all of us what it is.
So endometrial receptivity is kind of just a buzzword. It's like a catch-all phrase to represent, the ability for the endometrium, which is the inner lining of the uterus, or I sometimes refer to as the soil, whereas the embryo is the seed, if we think of like a garden. So it's just a catch-all phrase to say that this is endometrium that could accept an embryo and could grow an embryo if a good enough embryo was there. So we all sort of always break down the thought into the seed and the soil, right? So let's say you're going through IVF and let's say you have an embryo and let's say you put it in. Obviously, if you succeed and you have a healthy live birth, everyone says great embryo and great in uterus, right? And if you don't succeed, and there's different variations of not succeeding, we're always thinking to ourselves, okay, maybe it was the wrong embryo. Let's put in the next embryo. or maybe we didn't prepare that lining. What's going on? Stuff like that. But an endometrial receptivity is kind of just like a catch-all phrase.
Yes.
And truthfully, I think most of us as fertility experts would say that's kind of the black box at the moment. There's so much we don't know.
Yes.
I think a common example of that is, genetic testing of the embryo, or PGTA, is quite common practice now. And, but everybody who's experienced having a normal embryo, you still have about 40% of cases that you put in a beautiful genetically tested embryo and it doesn't even implant.
That's right. Exactly.
They're missing something else.
Yeah. Or maybe it is still part of the embryo. But anyway, that's another conversation.
That's 100% correct. So we always say chromosomes are a prerequisite, but not the only thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So then let's talk about compaction. What does this mean?
Yeah. So, okay. So I guess the question is, how do we know if someone's endometrium is receptive? So, I'll do a full disclosure. These are just my opinions. I think they're based on science and logic, but my opinions. I think the most important thing is clinical history. No matter what you do, that's always the most important. So if someone's had, 3 healthy pregnancy term deliveries, in my mind, she has a receptive uterus. Like, just because she's not getting pregnant next month doesn't mean it's the uterus, right?
Yes.
So, clinical correlation is always critical. For example, sometimes we really get obsessed, both patients and doctors, with numbers. So if the sperm concentration is lower than threshold, we say male factor, and that's why you're not getting pregnant. If your endometrial thickness is, under a certain number, let's say 6 or 7, we say thin lining, that's why you didn't get pregnant. It could be related, but you don't really know that's one. So clinical correlation frame, for example, is, let's say you have a man whose sperm numbers are just, great, but he's been involved with several healthy pregnancies. You wouldn't say he has a sperm problem. You would say he's quite a fertile man who's got multiple children. So we don't just follow numbers, we follow the clinical correlation. So
Sure.
For me, you always start with clinical correlation. So have you ever been pregnant before? If not, then there's no evidence of implantation. I'm not saying for sure it's the uterus or the lining, but there's no evidence of implantation. Whereas if you've been pregnant before, regardless if it's a miscarriage or healthy, that there's been an implantation.
Right.
I think that's really important. So you start with clinical correlation. Okay, the next thing most of us will do is do sort of a structural test. So, a small amount of women are born structurally with an, unusual uterus. And again, it's not so black and white where you can't conceive, but maybe that's part of the problem. So a lot of us will do ultrasounds or special ultrasounds called sono ultrasounds, or some people do HSG, which is hysterosalpingogram. Regardless, they're all forms of imaging to see if structurally everything looks fine. Mm-hmm. When we think about structurally, there's 2 types. You're either born with a structurally abnormal uterus, let's say it didn't form properly or only partially formed, or what we call acquired, where it happened throughout your life. So fibroids is a common example. You're not born with fibroids, but they develop as you get older, or polyps or scarring or things like that. So we start with clinical correlation, then we make sure you have a structurally normal uterus and make sure the inner cavity, again, structurally, there's no problem. Okay. You with me so far?
Yes. So I'm going to just add in, right? So are you the camp where, if you see any kind of septum at all, will you say, let's just get rid of it?
Oh, more complicated question. So
because it's there, it's all,
So a septum is a muscle band in the middle of the uterus, and that's because actually when we're fetuses, the uterus starts as the 2 sides and it has to form together, and then it has to hollow out. So it has to do something with the development where it didn't really hollow out. So it's a septum. Everybody has different schools of thought. So it depends really how big the septum is. There are one school of thought, which I think you're making me pick a side, is to say, again, clinical correlation. So if everything looks great in your workup, but you got a big septum and you've had 3 miscarriages, it's probably the septum. Get rid of it.
Right.
The more, I think most people would agree with that. The more complicated is if you have a septum and let's say you haven't even started trying, or you haven't had any miscarriage, do you prophylactically take it in? I'm going to defer that to another Instagram live.
Okay, fine.
because there's a bit more variables to it. But
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. All right. Let's get back to on track.
okay, so
So,
again, start with clinical correlation, then you do structural, which is some form of imaging. Okay, most people, so let's say you've never been pregnant and structurally you have a normal uterus inside and outside. The next thing we do, I would say around the world, is we sort of measure the endometrial thickness. So everyone who's ever gone through fertility, they've gone through fertility treatment when they understand what the word endometrial thickness means.
absolutely.
Um,
Absolutely.
and so just, I'm going to share my screen here. I think
Oh,
this,
okay. Let me share it for you. Wait,
can you
I don't know if, hang on a sec. Let me just,
can you see my screen?
oh, I can. How the heck did I, all right. I think I can. Yeah.
Okay, can you see it?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is a common picture we all see of the menstrual cycle. In the middle here is the hormones. At the top here is what happens inside our ovaries as a follicle grows and ovulates. And at the bottom is what happens in our uterus and endometrium. So as a general rule, we call day one, the start of shedding, so your menstruation. And what happens is a follicle will grow. As the follicle grows, the estrogen will rise. And as the estrogen rises, the lining will thicken. And that's something we can see on ultrasound. And then we
Yes.
have this LH surge, which is the signal to the follicle to rupture. And only after that does the progesterone start to rise. And we think, around mid-cycle is where, an embryo should hatch out and implant. Okay. So every time you hear the word endometrial thickness, I think it's very important to know that everyone's talking about how thick was it at the time of LH surge or the time of ovulation or at the time you're about to start progesterone for the transfer. So let's narrow our talk to the embryo transfer. So you have an embryo. Most of the time, people sort of do medicated protocols, which means here's a whole bunch of estrogen first, and we wait for your lining to thicken. And us, doctor, we sort of use it as a binary. We all pick our own favorite threshold, and let's say it's under, I don't know, 7. We say, sorry, it's too thin, cancel. Let's try something else. And then, that's when people, strategists like you, Mary, can sort of sometimes help us thicken it. But let's say it's above threshold 7. We say, all right, green light, everything looks great, and we go ahead and start progesterone. And depending on your clinic, on the 5th day or 6th day or 7th day, that's when you're putting the embryo. So the whole world is talking about estrogen, endometrial thickness, progesterone, embryo gets in, you're pregnant or you're not. Okay.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. So the first thing I thought to myself is like, yeah, single variables like thickness is important. That's like been correlated everywhere. It's not so black and white, but it is important. But there's got to be more information other than that. Like, how can you, you decided to start progesterone, and like there's 6 days where there's got to be something that can give you a better clue of how it's going. Okay, so that's how our study started. So I thought to myself, me and some of the physicians at Trio Fertility, let's have a look on the day of transfer. This is just a research project. So
Yes.
we went back and we took all the ultrasound pictures of the embryo transfer and we measured the thickness of the endometrium at transfer, and we compared it to the thickness before starting progesterone. So about a 6-day window. Okay. Now, before you do any study, you got to have a hypothesis. Okay. So general rule, estrogen thickens lining and progesterone thins lining, which makes sense. So if someone, for example, is on the IUD that has progesterone, they've got super thin lining. If someone's on birth control pills that has progesterone every day, their lining's very thin. So we know that progesterone has like a thinning effect and estrogen has a thickening effect. So the theory was that like if progesterone's acting properly on the lining, it should sort of compress. That was sort of the idea. So a lot of these pictures, I would say 90% of pictures I've seen, I think are incorrect. So here's a good example that shows you as the progesterone rise, the lining still thickens.
Is that you?
Yeah, I apologize. I don't really know how to turn that off.
Okay. That's all right. No problem.
Okay, so you can see this picture. It shows even after ovulation, the lining thickens, right? Can you see that here?
Did you move? Did you do another picture?
Can you see my cursor here?
Not right now. I saw it for a second.
Am I not sharing? Let me try it again.
Okay. No, you're,
Do you see it now?
oh, there, now I see it.
Okay,
Okay,
so this
there you go.
represents most of the pictures I've seen in their diagram. I think are incorrect. I know that's a bold comment to make, but
I
so,
love it. I love it that you're saying that.
okay, and it's on record, so you can come back and find me.
Yeah. So the
So,
textbook is wrong. Dr.
well,
Dan Nayot.
yeah, exactly. Just don't share this with the authors. So here you can see that all the textbooks make it look like the line
Yes.
thickens after the progesterone, which to me never really made sense. But once in a while, you will see a picture. Do you see this other one?
Yes.
So this one makes
Okay.
more sense.
Yes, that makes more sense.
You ovulate and then progesterone starts to rise, and it should. So the way I think about it is like estrogen pouring sand into like a pile, and then progesterone sort of like patting it down. That's where the term compaction. We just made it up. We thought it was clever.
Okay, so just so you know, because okay, I actually heard Dr. Casper speak last year, and I just thought of it as baking a cake. And like, you stick it in the oven
Okay.
and it rises and then it falls down.
Okay, I've never baked a cake. Like my wife's next to me here, and she can attest to that. I've never baked a cake in my life.
Okay, so anytime you stick it, okay, do you get that impact? Like, do you
Yeah,
get what I'm saying
I
now?
know it rises and then
It
shrinks.
rises and then it actually falls and compacts. So
Okay.
this is how I actually explain this to patients since I've heard about compaction.
Yeah. So this is mine and Bob's study, and we're very excited
Yeah.
about it. And there's different layers to it, but that was sort of the idea. So we went around and we retrospectively looked at a whole bunch of images, and we found some really interesting. We found that like the more compressed you were, the higher the prediction of whether it was going to work, which was really exciting, especially in medicine. Like it's exciting when you find a gradient, as in the more compact, the better, the less like it was like you could tell that it was like going really stepwise. It wasn't
Right.
like all over the place. And then our second study was to say, okay, let's see if we can control this for just normal embryos. Because for all you know, you're going to have a perfect lining and not put a great embryo in, right?
Yes. Right.
So we did a study where we just did it for euploid embryos. And the same finding we found. So we think that we're onto something. Of course, a lot of more studies have to be done. I think the biggest validation for us is that there's been other big centers around the world now. Also, they've read we had 2 papers in fertility and sterility, which is, one of the big journals.
Yes.
And that got other people thinking, which is how good science works. And we've seen other people in different clinics sort of represent similar outcomes. So we certainly think we're onto something here. Of course, it's not the only variable, but it's nice to have a second variable. Okay. One other thing I want to mention, I don't know how much time we have. Can you still see my screen?
Yeah, we're good. Yes, we're good. Love
So
it.
everybody talks about endometrial thickness, but
Yes.
not everybody talks about the pattern. Okay. So the other part we think is really critical is the pattern of the lining. So in here, you see a common ultrasound. So this is the uterus, kind of looks like a pear.
Yeah.
This is the endometrial thickness. This is the endometrium, sort of the inner cavity. And the way they measure thickness is they kind of go perpendicular. Okay. They go to like the thickest area and they go perpendicular. So that's the number you keep hearing. So you know what they're actually doing when they say that number. But in this picture, you can see what we expect to see in the first half of the cycle, the estrogen part or the pre-ovulation part. And we call it trilaminar or 3, triple stripes. So you can see a line here, a line there, and a line in the middle. So this is what we expect to see. We think this is a good thing. And once you start progesterone, you can see the impact of that on the ultrasound. So not only do we think it's supposed to compress, but we think it's supposed to luteinize, and so it starts to change shape. So we have like started looking at this stuff. We call it non-invasive because we're not doing biopsies, it's just ultrasound. Right. But we look at the dynamic changes, how thick, pattern, and what did it change like and stuff like that. But we're learning a lot of things. You're going to make many mistakes as you go along. I'll tell you some, but maybe I'll stop if you have any questions.
Well, then if you're saying that now you're looking for compaction before you implant, right? So are you now then doing the cycle before an FET, frozen embryo transfer, to check it out? And then the next time you actually have an idea of when you're going to really implant?
Yeah, so good question. So I think I've evolved in the way I'm using it. So when we first found it, I was just so excited by these findings because it was logical and no one's done it before, and it was such strong results. And I sort of said to people, but remember, we did it before starting progesterone and day of transfer. And I thought to myself, okay, they untransferred. I can't really do that because if I don't like what I see, the embryo's already thawed. What am I going to do with it?
Exactly.
So that's what you're saying. Maybe the cycle before. So what we tried to do was we said, why don't we do an ultrasound 2 days before or a day before? And if we need to cancel, at least the embryo is frozen. Or if we need to adjust, maybe I'll add more progesterone or whatever we're going to do. But then, again, anytime you switch this, the study was before progesterone and after 6 days, and now we're using after 4 days as our marker. So there's a bit of an issue with that. Also, sometimes when you do the ultrasound with transfer, you're doing an internal ultrasound. And when you're checking your lining before transfer, you're doing abdominal. So these little changes make big differences.
Oh, so these are abdominal ultrasounds. None of it is transvaginal.
Well, on transfer day, it's abdominal.
Well, yes.
But usually on lining checks, it's transvaginal.
Yes.
So those are a little bit different ways to look at it. Also, does a full bladder, which compresses the uterus, does that affect things and things like that? So these are all the things we're still actively working on.
Wow.
One thing we found out is, like, let's say thin lining, if you're 6 or 7 or 8, you're not going to compress that thing into 4. So we just thought in the thin line, we didn't really see much of a change, whether it worked or didn't work. So it's mostly kind of those like regular lining that we thought it was a really good prognosis.
Got it. And then, so how much are you waiting to compact before you implant?
So to me, it's just one of the variables. I don't use this as a one or a be all, but I'll tell you how it's changed my thinking on how to do the transfers. And maybe if we talk in 1 year, it'll be totally different, but I think that's what's exciting in our field. So here's a good example. So traditionally, let's say you're about to do a transfer, you give estrogen, you come for a lining check. And if you hit like 8.5 or 9, the doctor says, great, go ahead and start progesterone. So one thing I thought is, now what I'll do is I'll look back at the IVF cycle, because she did IVF in order to get embryos. And I say, well, that was a cycle with lots of follicles and super high estrogen. How thick did the lining get before we did the trigger? Oh, it got to 12. Okay. When we're doing, so now I know what sort of the capacity of the lining is. So I will wait for the lining to reach its peak, because I have a kind of a good window because of the previous cycle. So even if that patient reaches 8, I say, wait a little bit more time, let it reach 11, 12, and then I start progesterone.
Really?
So those are adjustments that we're making.
Okay. Yeah. But, when you're doing stim drugs, though, versus just solely estrogen, sometimes wouldn't it be differential in growth? Because, when you're creating so many follicles, I just assume then it'll be easier to develop the endometrial lining.
But the way we view it is you probably have a capacity. So you regardless of how much estrogen I'm going to give you, you're never going to grow to like 4 feet. Or your endometrium has a limit, and we think IVF is probably a good window to your limit, because those are pretty high estrogens.
Okay, so then instead of just doing the 10 days, then you can go on for a lot longer potentially.
Those are the adjustments we're making from what we're learning. I mean, I haven't published data on it, so some people will say, like, who cares? Where's the data on that? But again, it's a combination of logic and learning from the past, but we're going to publish these studies soon.
Very cool. So just out of curiosity, have other physicians followed suit in what you have been doing, or are you and Dr. Casper the only ones?
I don't know. Yeah, it's a good question. I think once it hits fertility, sterility, it gets people's brains going. So there's more conversation. I mean, we're talking about it. So to me, it's, the word's already getting out there. But, I think there's always like a bias, right? Like sometimes you fall in love with your own ideas kind of thing. So I think it's very logical and it makes sense, but it's not you can't proceed, you can't get pregnant unless you see compaction kind of thing. It's just one of the many variables.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think it's exciting, and it's definitely very progressive. But, as far as I know, at least in and around Toronto area, you guys are the only ones doing it.
Okay. Well, I didn't catch on then.
Not yet. Maybe I'll have a chat with some of the other physicians then.
I can go a little bit deeper if you're interested, or we can pivot.
What time is it? Let's see. What do you want to pivot to?
I don't know. I guess we can talk about AI and the uterus.
Okay, cool. Love it. Let's do it. I was just going to say, we don't want to go on forever, but gosh, I can't even find, I don't even know how to do this. Sometimes I have a third person look to see if, because when we go on live, I can't see like the Facebook people if there's any questions. So I can't even find it. So forget it. Sorry, guys, if you have questions, we're not answering it. Or maybe we are already answering it. We don't know. Okay, so tell us about AI with all this.
Okay, so just 2 minutes on AI in general for I
Yeah,
don't know who's listening and who's not. So AI is like a buzzword you keep hearing. It means artificial intelligence. Other word for it is like neural networks or and things like that. But essentially, traditionally, we used to think of computers as just machines that we tell them what to do. They're just if-then commands. So like you go forward, if you hit a wall, turn right. If you hit a wall, turn right. If you hit a wall, turn right. Those are kind of that was the old
right,
school thinking of computers. And now we learned that like computers can teach themselves, which is amazing. Like a good example is like nowadays computers are so good. You can show the computer the rules of chess.
right,
So like last version was you show the computer thousands and thousands of chess games and it becomes really good because it remembers all the different variables. Now you can just show it like the rules of chess and it can teach itself the different simulations. um, that's AI, like self-learning. So
yes.
AI in medicine, everybody knows it's the future, but sort of the hype is ahead of the practicality of it. In my opinion, the best use of AI is in imaging in things that the clinicians can't see. So the uterus is a good example. So we can see the lining, we can see the thickness, we can see the pattern, but you can imagine if a computer scanned this image and it knew thousands of uteruses that implanted and thousands of images that didn't implant, it can pick up stuff that me and you cannot pick up, like
Right.
what's the surface volume, what is the intensity of this, and things like that. So we're applying at Future Fertility the same principles to the eggs and AI as the uterus.
Wow, very cool.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're part of that whole thing, world.
Yeah.
Neat.
I think
Okay,
it's the future. Yeah.
totally. I love, you know, I love science. I really do. And then but I always want to just also bring it back to sometimes, we try to manipulate and I always say we want to encourage nature as much as possible through science and all the other interventions. But at the end of the day, nature wins.
Totally.
Right, so we don't want to forget that piece, and there is still some mystical pieces involved because otherwise we would have had it all figured out and everybody would get pregnant.
Yeah. Then it would be so boring.
Then it'd be so boring.
Right.
Who would want that,
Right.
right? So but I love what you're doing, and I think it is very progressive and
I'd
just
love to hear your version of like you know your expertise in the endometrial implantation and stuff like that. What's the newest approach in your field?
so in Chinese medicine, it's interesting that you say the newest approach. Well, the newest approach is really integrative medicine, right? Old school approach is literally, only acupuncture, only herbal medicine, and that's that. And now in the new science, it'd be like, let's do integrative medicine. I love it that you can actually see through diagnostics and visualize through an ultrasound, right? We can't do that. I can't see into your uterus.
Right.
But certainly what's very cool is, there's, unfortunately, I don't know if you know this, but perhaps you do, like when it comes to trying to study acupuncture, for example, specifically, there are over 15,000 studies on acupuncture, but at the end of the day, I still say it's really tough.
15,000?
Over 15,000 studies on
Oh my
acupuncture.
God.
Yeah.
Try doing a literature review on that.
Yeah, no. And interesting because before, back in the day, it was much more based on pain, right? And now there's a huge interest with regards to acupuncture for fertility. And of course, specifically for IVF, and that's, where everybody's focus is. And primarily the studies have been always about the implantation, and to us from our field it's like that's just not sufficient. If you're looking at pre and post embryo transfer or just one session before, it may not help, but there's not enough evidence, right? But the truth is it's um like if you're taking, for example, well, going back to the planting the seed into a soil. Well, you can't just water it once and call it a day. You have to do it consistently, right? So what we do know about acupuncture is that it does totally increase blood volume into the ovaries, into the uterus, and in fact, in the whole internal organ area, right? So it's like, so that's interesting. An interesting thing is that it can potentially increase cellular energy, ATP, in the mitochondria of the cells. So it's like, that could be interesting because perhaps it might have a impact on ovulation, right? The health of the eggs, kind of like CoQ10 does.
Mm-hmm.
But there's not enough evidence or science that goes towards it. There's some like a second-handed way of doing it. So there's a study by Lee Hellinger Rubin, for example, 2015, it's dating back a wee bit, but she was looking at acupuncture and other types of things like supplements and Chinese herbal medicine along with the acupuncture and done 3 months prior to IVF retrieval, right? Egg retrieval. And they saw that it didn't actually increase the number that was retrieved, and it didn't actually increase the pregnancy rates. But what they saw the difference in was live births. So at the end of the day, what's most important? Like, who cares if you have any kind of implantation if you don't have live birth,
Right.
right? Or, it doesn't matter if you take out 20 eggs, 20 follicles, when you only end up with one viable embryo, right? Mm-hmm. So for us, it's again much more quality based versus quantity based. And so when you're talking about the endometrial lining, and I like the personalized thing that you discussed, because again, you can use it as a marker, like 8 millimeter as a marker, like across the board, and like that just drives me crazy, because I know, for example, there's one woman, I'm like, you're like a 6 millimeter. I don't think you're ever going to go higher than that. This is you, and I bet you can do this, right? And so she advocated for herself, and now at 6 millimeter with trilaminar, what you showed, trilaminar lining.
That's the key.
And then she ended up with twins, right? They canceled the first month. I said, you got to advocate, right? So she did, and now she's pregnant with twins with a 6 millimeter lining. So it's like, we can't hold it to a specific, it's like we want to fit a round peg into a square hole, right? And I think we need more leeway than that. So with what you're talking about, I think it shows that there's more thought, as in personalized care. So I love that.
Yeah, pretty neat.
Mm-hmm. Anyway, that's my thoughts. Did that answer your questions?
Yeah, no, I like it. I feel like there's so much in both our fields to, we should like record this video and come back for in 10 years, and we'll think we were just so juvenile, and what were we thinking?
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so thank you so much for being here, and I would love to have you on again, and we'll have another conversation, whether whatever you're up to. And I love that whole AI business as well, and everything that you're up to. So we should just have another conversation.
Sounds good. Okay? Thanks for having me.
All right, thank you. Okay, you have a great night.
Bye-bye.
Bye.